Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving the over 100,000 computing professionals and students who are ACM's members. I'm Terry Linkletter, your moderator. I've worked as a software engineer since 1966, participating in a number of development paradigm shifts along the way, as you can imagine. In the past, I've led continuous improvement teamwork for software development, both for productivity and for quality at Microsoft. I've managed software engineering and verification and validation and quality assurance organizations at Fortune 500 firms and at several internet startups. I'm currently on the IT faculty at Central Washington University. I'm really looking forward to hearing this webinar. You can see more on my background in the bio window on the webcast screen. Well, you know that ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. You know, our members can stay competitive in the constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen there. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. ACM provides timely computing information published by ACM, including communications of the ACM and Q magazines, and access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, and international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics, and support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, the ACM Turing and ACM Infosys Foundation Awards. So ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, let's take another quick look at the housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. Note in the top right corner of the slide area on your screen, there's a button that will allow you to enlarge the slides. You may also enlarge the slides at any time by dragging the corner of the slide window. The slides will advance automatically during this event. During the presentation, you can minimize the slide area, Q&A, and bio screens using the buttons on the bottom panel. You can also use a number of widgets also found on the bottom panel, including Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, and a resource list where you can get a copy of these slides. If you're experiencing problems with our web interface, please refresh your console by pressing the F5 key in Windows, or Command R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser if you're on a mobile device, or close and relaunch the presentation. You can also visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help widget below the slide window. To control volume, please just adjust the master volume on your computer. At the end of our presentation, we will have time for questions, and we hope you have several. If you think of a question during the presentation, please just go ahead and type it into the Q&A box and click on the Submit button. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to begin submitting questions. You may also use the Q&A box and the survey at the end to suggest topics for future webinars. At the end of the presentation, you'll see the survey open in your browser. Please take a minute to fill it out and help us improve our webinars. Now, this session is being recorded and will be archived. You'll receive an automatic email notification when it's available, so you can let your friends know, or you can check learning.acm.org in a few days for updates. So you can also use the Facebook and Twitter widgets on the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag #ACMWebinarPhoneGap. And we'll be watching for your tweets. If you have questions, they will be in the process of being analyzed for asking Andrew during this presentation. Today's presentation is Develop Hybrid Mobile Applications with Apache Cordova and PhoneGap Enterprise by Andrew Savory. Andrew Savory is Mobile Services and Solutions Evangelist at Adobe and is responsible for guiding and evangelizing the vision of Adobe's mobile solutions. At Adobe, he provides a bridge between engineering and the wider world, ensuring everyone knows about the new features and functionalities that are being built and how best to use them with a mobile focus. Prior to Adobe, Andrew spent several years working in a mobile consortium building mobile platforms and was UK Managing Director of a systems integrator, where he pioneered mobile experiences and delivered a wide range of enterprise content management solutions. Andrew is passionate about open development, is active in a number of open source communities, and is also an Apache Software Foundation member. Andrew, we look forward to your presentation here today.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Terry. So, there are three things that I would like to cover today with you. I'd like to talk about what hybrid mobile applications are and why they should be of interest. I'd like to take you through an introduction to Apache Cordova and PhoneGap and show you how to use the PhoneGap tools to build mobile applications. And then I'd like to give you a quick introduction to PhoneGap Enterprise and talk a little bit about the future of hybrid mobile applications. So let's start with different types of mobile application. There are really four different types of mobile application that you can have: native, cross-platform, hybrid, or web application. Each of these frameworks have various benefits and drawbacks to them. So let's just take a moment to understand them. Native applications are typically applications built with the software provided by the mobile platform provider. So for example, iOS has the Xcode development environment and the Objective-C or Swift programming languages. Android has a version of Java, and it has the Android Studio development environment, and so on. Developing native apps is often quite a quick way to build an app because the toolkits are highly optimized for getting apps delivered on that mobile platform, and they're in some way endorsed by the platform owner, who will offer optimized routes to getting your apps onto the app stores. Apps developed with these software kits tend to look very similar to each other and look like they belong on the platform. And you can usually build very, very responsive apps this way. Native does have a drawback though. If you want to build a native application for multiple different platforms, so for example, iOS and Android and Windows Phone, then you end up having to learn the SDK for each of these different tools. And you have to learn the specific programming language for each of these platforms as well. And even worse than that, you typically end up with multiple different code bases, each of which need to be maintained in parallel. And usually you'll end up having to have multiple development teams as well. And this can be a real challenge to manage. So the next option that many people take in terms of building mobile applications is to look for cross-platform environments. Things like Xamarin or Marmalade or Qt. And these provide an intermediary route that you can take for building mobile apps. They typically have some sort of third-party language that you can use, and third-party tooling and SDKs that allow you to build apps that provide a native-like presentation and native-like performance, but using a third-party development kit. And the advantage of this is you would typically end up with just one version of your code to manage across multiple platforms, but you would still be dependent on a third party as well as the app platform owner to control the destiny of your applications. The last option that you could take would be to build a mobile website that would work within a mobile device. And the advantage of this is that it works anywhere. And we've already solved many of the challenges around delivering applications on multiple different screen sizes and screen resolutions and with multiple different device capabilities. So that can be a great way to deliver a mobile experience, but it's also somewhat limited. You don't have access, for example, to all of the native APIs that make mobile experiences so unique. You don't have access to location, any of the other sensors like camera or heartbeat monitors. You don't have access to any of the rich types of information available on mobile devices like contact lists and photo galleries. So the web experience can be somewhat degraded. There are also challenges around making sure that your mobile website would work in an offline context so that your users can continue to work with the application even when there's no network connection. And one more problem with mobile web is that consumers increasingly expect to be able to engage with companies and brands via the app stores, and they use the app stores as their first place to start searching for a way to work with a brand. And with mobile web, you obviously don't have an app in an app store, so you're missing out on that discoverability. You're also missing out on meeting the user's expectations. So clearly there's a need for an alternative way to build your applications. And hybrid really is the solution to that. Hybrid allows you to take the best of native, cross-platform and web and to deliver apps that meet many of those requirements whilst avoiding many of those challenges. So what exactly are hybrid applications? Well, they're applications that can run on your phone, but effectively the entire application user interface is a web runtime, so basically a fancy browser window. And that means that you can build your applications using the web technologies that you probably already know and that you probably already love. So, for example, HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript. These are all open technologies, and they're under the stewardship of organizations like W3C. So you can be sure that they're going to be driven by general best interest in web platforms rather than the whims of any particular platform manufacturer or device provider. There's an extra component to hybrid applications in that they contain a native wrapper, which is just enough to enable you to submit your hybrid applications to the app stores. And this is important, as I said, to ensure that you have discoverability of your applications, and also so that people can actually download them onto the device. The final part of hybrid applications is that they also include just enough native code to provide you with access to device APIs. And that native code exposes JavaScript interfaces that you can use to talk to the native APIs without having to code in the native languages. And this is a significant advantage over the going down just the native route or even the cross-platform route. There are multiple different sources of hybrid technologies. There are a number of open source platforms. So Apache Cordova is probably the best known. Then there's the Sencha GPL'd hybrid technology. There are many commercial platforms that are making use of solutions like Cordova. So PhoneGap is probably the best known. There are solutions from Kony, from Telerik, and PhoneGap is also included in Cordova is also included in bigger toolkits from companies like IBM and Oracle. There are some other benefits to hybrid applications alongside being able to use the native web technologies that you already know. And that's that you can very easily reach more ecosystems effectively for free. So as well as iOS and Android, if you wanted to target Windows or BlackBerry, Kindle Fire OS or Firefox OS, it's very easy just to add support for those extra platforms. So I've mentioned PhoneGap and I've mentioned Apache Cordova, and the two are often used interchangeably. So I'd just like to clarify what the difference is between the two and help you to understand when to use each. So Apache Cordova is the open source engine that powers PhoneGap. So similar to how WebKit is the engine that powers Safari, Linux is the kernel that powers Android, Cordova is the underlying technology that powers PhoneGap. The original PhoneGap codebase was contributed to the Apache Software Foundation when Adobe acquired the company behind the PhoneGap technology. And this was really fantastic because the ASF represents a neutral ground for collaboration and for open development. And so as a result of this contribution, many more companies were able to start contributing to the Cordova project. And now we have companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Google all working alongside each other to make sure that Cordova is the best possible hybrid technology available. Now, PhoneGap itself is just one commercial implementation of Apache Cordova. And PhoneGap as an organization is able to do things like provide hosting services and publishing applications to app stores, things that Apache as a charitable organization can't do. Many of the commands are interchangeable that you use with PhoneGap and Cordova, and PhoneGap provides some additional convenience commands for doing things like remote builds. All Apache Cordova projects work with PhoneGap, and all PhoneGap projects will also work with Cordova. So what makes up the PhoneGap framework? There are a number of key parts available in key pieces to the PhoneGap jigsaw puzzle. So at the root of everything, you have a PhoneGap project. You also have the PhoneGap command line interface, which allows you to interact with your project and add functionality and features to your project. There's also a desktop application which allows you to simply build your projects from scratch without having to interact with the command line interface. There's a developer app which helps you test out your applications on mobile devices without going through quite so many hoops in terms of sideloading them. There's also the PhoneGap Build remote build service, which allows you to build your PhoneGap applications across a range of platforms in the cloud. And finally, there's PhoneGap Enterprise, which I'll show you a little later on. So that's the constituent parts of PhoneGap. Let's take a look now in more detail at how you actually go about working with PhoneGap. The first thing you need to do is meet the installation prerequisites for working with PhoneGap. And PhoneGap is built upon Node.js. And Node.js, if you're not familiar with it, is a cross-platform runtime environment built using JavaScript. Applications can be written in JavaScript, and you can then run them in the runtime on OS X, Windows, Linux, and BSD. And this is critical to being able to do cross-platform development with your hybrid apps. Now, a core part of Node is the Node package manager, and functionality in Node is bundled up as packages, and the package manager will automatically install them and manage dependencies for your application as required. There's also a registry of Node packages where it will download the packages from. And if you're familiar with Perl, then npm is similar to Perl's cpan, and if you're familiar with PHP, it's roughly similar to pair. So let's take a look now at building our first PhoneGap application, installing PhoneGap, sorry. So the first step we need to do is actually install PhoneGap itself. So using the Node package manager, you simply have to type npm install -g PhoneGap, and that will install it globally and make sure it's available for all users. And depending on your setup, your particular software configuration, you may need to use the sudo command in order to make that install globally. Now, I did mention that one of the key parts of Node.js is that it works across platforms and that you can develop your apps on multiple platforms. So if you're on Windows, you would do exactly the same thing. Just npm install -g PhoneGap, and very soon you'll have your PhoneGap environment available for development. So once you've installed PhoneGap, the first thing you probably want to do is make sure that it's working. So if you run PhoneGap -v, it will tell you what version of PhoneGap you've got installed. And this is going to be particularly useful for you when you're interacting with the wider PhoneGap community and asking questions. And you'll probably want to quote the version that you're using, as it's a quite fast-moving project and there are quite a few changes between versions. You can also get further help about the commands available by typing PhoneGap help, and then you can specify each individual command to find more information about those commands. So once we've got PhoneGap installed, let's go ahead and actually create a PhoneGap application. And it's really simple to do. All you need to do is type PhoneGap create and the name of your app. Now, there are lots of extra command line parameters you can specify here to, for example, configure the bundle ID, the full path, and things like that. But for the sake of demo purposes, I've just taken the simplest option, and by default, without having not specified anything else, PhoneGap will create for me a template application based on a hello world that's publicly available. And if I look inside the ACM demo directory for the application that I've just created, you'll see that I've got 4 folders and 1 file. So let's take a look now at what constitutes a PhoneGap application. And if we look inside that directory, the top level project directory, we'll see that we've got hooks, platforms, plugins, www, and config.xml. Now, the hooks directory is based on the Git hooks, if you're familiar with Git. And the idea is that you can place short scripts in this directory that will be executed before or after particular CLI commands are run. For example, before the install command, before plugins are added, after the build is run, and so on. And this is really useful if you want to copy additional resources into a platform directory, or do some extra configuration, or add some extra information as part of your build process. It's really for power users though, so try not to use it too much. The platforms directory is the location where all of your native code will be for each platform that you're building on. So I mentioned that PhoneGap applications provide just enough native code in order to be able to run in the App Store and to provide access to the native APIs. And it's in these directories that all of that native code lives. So if you're building for iOS, you would have Objective-C or Swift source code here and Xcode project files. If you're building for Android, you would have your Java files and your Gradle config files and so on. And the same for other platforms as well. The plugins directory is where specific functionality can be placed, and you can add specific functionality by adding new plugins. So examples of plugins would be access to the camera, access to the file system, access to the GPS, and so on. And the plugins, once they're installed, are placed in this directory, and then they're copied across to the platforms whenever you build your platform. The final directory, the www directory, is where your web application would go. So this is where all of your HTML, all of your cascading style sheets, all of your JavaScript would be located. And also any third-party libraries, for example, AngularJS or Ionic, perhaps Topcoat for smooth CSS animations and so on. The final file that makes up your application is the config.xml, and this contains configuration metadata for example, for your App Store listings. It contains preferences like screen orientation. It can also contain platform-specific configurations like menu bar options on iOS. So that's the makeup of an application. Now how do we actually start building it for particular platforms? And there's actually a couple of different ways you can do this. The simplest way is simply to type PhoneGap local build iOS if I wanted to build for iOS, or PhoneGap local build Android if I wanted to build for Android. If you want to be more specific, you can also use Cordova platform add iOS, and then you can run the build command. But this is just really a shortcut that PhoneGap provides, because you're almost certainly going to need to build it anyway. And as I said, if you want to build for Android, the command is almost exactly the same. The only difference is that you specify Android as your platform. And for all of the other platforms, the names are fairly obvious as well, so Firefox OS and so on. Now you'll see in this screenshot that the Node Package Manager is actually going away and downloading all of the additional dependencies that are required in order to build this application for Android. In the previous screenshot, it didn't show the iOS dependencies because I already had those installed. So Node Package Manager really makes it easy to build for the multiple platforms. Once you've run the build command, if you were to look into the platforms directory, you would see that you now have folders available for each of the native platforms that you're targeting. So in this case, Android and iOS. And as I mentioned earlier, if you look into each of these platform directories in more detail, you'll see that basically an entire native project is available there. So we have an Xcode project and all of the files required to build for iOS in the iOS directory. And then we have all of the Android configurations and properties and code in the Android directory. So once you've built your application, how do you actually run it and try it out on your mobile platform? Now, most of these screenshots I will be using, for most of these screenshots I'll be using iOS, and that's simply because the iOS simulator is quite a bit faster than the Android simulator. But you could use either one, they would all work, and you could also be deploying to a device that's plugged into your computer as well. So in this case, I wanted to run on iOS, and by default it's going to use the simulator. So all I needed to do was say PhoneGap run iOS, and after building the application, it deployed it automatically for me into the simulator, and then it ran. And it's as simple as that. So with just a very few commands, you can go from having no application at all to having a template Hello World application that's running on the simulator. And it's really straightforward to get started with PhoneGap. Now I mentioned that the iOS platform directory included an Xcode project. You can, of course, open that up inside Xcode, and you could start working on your application from here. And this is great because it means you could run the simulator from within Xcode. You can use all of the debugging tools available in Xcode if you wanted to. And that's one way of developing your application. But in an ideal scenario, you want to try and do as much of your development as possible in the www directory, and typically using web tools as well. And only switch to the native SDKs if you really have to, or for doing things like app submission, where they make app submission much simpler to do. So as web developers, you probably already have a selection of favorite development environments. If you're on a Mac, perhaps you're using Sublime Text. So of course you can open up the source code files in the www directory and start working with them there. Perhaps you're using the Atom editor. So of course you can use Atom as well. Maybe you're using brackets. So you can open up the file in brackets just as easily. And it's all just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's super easy to edit in whatever your preferred editing environment is. And of course, I mentioned that this is all about cross-platform development as well. So perhaps you're a Windows developer, and perhaps you're using Visual Studio. And Visual Studio's got some great tools available now around building hybrid applications. So you could be editing your source code files in Visual Studio as well. Or perhaps your preference is for more minimal editors that you already have muscle memory for knowing the keyboard shortcuts for. So of course you can open up your source files in Vi if you wanted to, or maybe even you could open up the source code in your favorite email client like Emacs. So really, this is one of the big wins with hybrid. You're not tied to the native SDKs, which are sometimes truly awful. You can use whatever development environment you're most comfortable with and that you've got set up in your preferred manner. And also, because it's the web, you can use all of the great tooling that's available for debugging web applications. One example of this is the web inspector that's available for iOS, which you can attach to a running application, and you can look through your code and see what errors are being thrown in the JavaScript console and so on. And that makes life really easy as a developer. So that's the basics of building your application and using web technologies. But what about accessing all of these unique native device capabilities that I mentioned right at the start? I said that one of the advantages of going down the hybrid route was that you could access the native APIs, and that's exactly what we're going to do next. So pretty much everything in the PhoneGap application is available as a plugin, and this is this modular Lego-style architecture is great. It means that your applications by default are only going to contain the capabilities and the functionalities that they need, which means they're going to be faster, they're going to be lighter, quicker to download, and ultimately easier to manage as well. And this plugin architecture is also really useful if you're a hardware manufacturer or you're a software service provider, because it means you can provide plugins yourself that other people can use that give access to specific features of your device or specific capabilities of your service. So if you're releasing a device with a heart rate monitoring, for example, you could release a plugin that talk to that. If you're running something like a push messaging service, you could release a plugin that talk to that. So let's look in more detail at the advantages of this approach. If I wanted to look at the compass, for example, in my mobile device, if I was taking the native approach, there might be as many as 4 or 5 different programming languages and 4 or 5 different APIs that I would need to learn in order to use that specific device functionality. And this is a real learning nightmare. It makes app development really difficult. And of course, you've got 3 or 4 different developer websites to wade through to find the specific documentation for accessing that capability. And each platform approaches this in its own unique way. And that makes for very slow app development. In PhoneGap land, no surprises, it's really simple. All you need to do is add a plugin for the device capability that you want to address. And this plugin will comprise 2 parts. There'll be an element of native code, which you don't need to go near. It's simply there to make sure that the application works. And then there'll be a JavaScript API that you can use, that you can add to your web application in order to talk to that native code. So bearing in mind that these plugins are typically available across multiple different platforms, that means you only have one JavaScript API that you need to program for, rather than learning each individual platform's functionality. So let's take a look at how that would work. So I've successfully added my plugin. I then go into my application, and here highlighted in green you can see that I've added just a few simple lines of JavaScript to make use of that functionality. So we're just calling the getCurrentHeading JavaScript API with a couple of callbacks, one for success and one for failure. Now, unfortunately here, we're illustrating one of the challenges of mobile development in that the simulator doesn't actually support the Compass API. It hasn't actually implemented it. But that's okay, because we can simply run the application on our mobile device instead. And when you run it on the mobile device, you'll see that it actually returns the Compass heading. So we've actually managed to test both of our callbacks, even though we didn't necessarily intend to. And of course, this approach works for all of the different plugins that you might want to add. So I can go ahead and add multiple more plugins. So I've got the Compass plugin, I could add the camera plugin, I could add the device plugin, which gives me some low-level information about the device that my app is running on. I could run the network information plugin, which will tell me what sort of connectivity my application has got. And let's take a look at that as another example of how you would use the JavaScript APIs. So here I've simply added the app check connection call, and you can see that it's going away and querying the connection type via the JavaScript API, and this time it does work in the simulator, and it's telling me that the simulator's got a Wi-Fi connection. And all of these APIs are fairly similar in the way they work, which makes developing for PhoneGap, developing web apps for PhoneGap, really easy to do. And you can access all of this native capability from right within your JavaScript. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that some things don't work in the simulator, and sometimes you have to break out your device and test things in the device. And while the process of running PhoneGap Run and getting the app to start up on your device is not particularly laborious, it does take time. And that's where the PhoneGap Developer application comes in. So you can grab it from the Google Play Store or grab it from the iTunes Store and install it on your device right away. And I believe there's versions being worked on for Firefox OS and Windows Phone as well. And once you've got this installed, it eliminates some of the round-trip work involved in testing your application. So what you can do in your PhoneGap application directory is simply type PhoneGap serve. And this will start up a minimal web server which will serve the content of your www directory across to the PhoneGap developer application running on your device. And you can configure your device to connect to your particular development server, your development machine, your desktop computer. And if all goes well, it will report success. And then shortly afterwards, you'll see your application running right there on your mobile device. Now, where things get interesting is you can now start editing the files in your www directory, and each time you save them, the PhoneGap Developer App will automatically reload, which means you no longer have to mess around in the console pushing the latest version of your app across to the device. And this is really important for speeding up the development process and allowing you to build application that little bit faster. Now, so far I've talked an awful lot about the command line environment, but perhaps you're more comfortable with graphical user interfaces. You don't really want to have to work with the command line. So something that's under development now and available on GitHub if you want to try it out at the URL at the bottom right there is a PhoneGap graphical user interface. And this basically replicates a lot of the functionality available in the CLI in the form of a nice user interface. So I can go in and I can click on the plus button and I can quite simply create a new PhoneGap project, or I can add an existing PhoneGap project that I already have lying around. And if I select Create New PhoneGap Project, it will just prompt me for the bare minimum of configuration information that I need to provide. So, for example, the local path of my app, the name that I want to give it, and also the bundle ID that uniquely identifies it in the app stores. And when I click on Create Project, it will go away and it will create that template application for me in just the way we did with the CLI earlier on. Once it's created, it will show the apps in a list, and you'll see here that I added the Hello World app that we set up a little bit earlier on as well. So instantly we've got a handy list to see all of our apps. And if I click on the little play button, it will do the work of setting up the server for me as well. And so now, of course, I can point my PhoneGap Developer App on my phone to this server and start developing right away. And I haven't had to type a single command into the CLI. So this is a really simple way to get up and running with PhoneGap applications. The last, or the penultimate piece of the jigsaw puzzle is PhoneGap Build. Now it's great to be able to develop on your local machine, but sometimes you don't want to have to go through the hassle of installing all of the SDKs that you need and having multiple different development environments on everybody's machines. Sometimes you want to very quickly build across multiple different platforms at once without having to go through all the process involved in doing so. And PhoneGap Build is basically a cloud-hosted build infrastructure that you can use to develop your applications. And let's take a little look at how that works. So I mentioned at the very start that PhoneGap provides some utility functions in addition to those available in Cordova, and the PhoneGap Build integration is one of those key sets of functionalities. So with the PhoneGap remote command, you can remotely build your application on various different platforms. And this is a huge time saver. So if, for example, I wanted to build my demo application on Android, previously I had to do remote build, I had to do PhoneGap Build Android, and it would compile everything locally. If, however, I do PhoneGap Remote Build Android, it will send a copy of my application up to the PhoneGap Build server, where it will build it for me. And if all things go well, eventually it will come back and tell me that the build was complete. And if I go back over to the web user interface for PhoneGap Build, I'll be able to see that my app is listed there. And there's even a QR code that I can scan if I've got a QR code scanner on my mobile device. And that will download the application onto my device so I can see if it's working correctly. And this is another huge time saver that just makes it really easy to develop mobile applications. The last thing that I'd like to talk about is a little bit different. So I've mentioned PhoneGap Enterprise a few times, and I think this really is important as it exemplifies how hybrid apps are changing the way we perceive mobile app development and changing the way that changing the roles of the people that are responsible for looking after mobile apps as well. So Adobe have got a content management system called Experience Manager, and the PhoneGap Enterprise is a part of that. So on the right-hand side, you'll see an application that's running in the iOS simulator. Now this application was actually built within the content management system. So if I log into the CMS, the first thing I typically see is a list of the different sites that I'm managing in Experience Manager. And these could be desktop sites, they could be mobile sites, responsive sites. It doesn't really matter. And the paradigm for editing sites in Experience Manager is based on a drag and drop user interface that works on desktop and tablet, and it's very easy to use. But what we've added to this is the ability to create and manage mobile applications within that same content management system. So here you'll see that I've got a list of my different mobile apps. I've got the Geometrics app that's running in the simulator on the right. I've got an event app, and I've got another test application there as well. And all of these apps I can go in and I can edit within the content management system without having to use the CLI, without having to use an IDE, and I can change the content of my app. So on this next screen, I can see all of the different screens in my application presented as pages within the CMS that I can go in and change and update. And I can go into any of these pages and I can just start adding components to the page, dragging and dropping new text areas or new images, and then typing in some text. And it's really designed for marketing people to be able to edit and update content. But here, bear in mind, they're editing, updating the content of their mobile application. So where do we go from here? Well, the next step is having a PhoneGap Enterprise application on your mobile device, which can connect to your content management system, either a solution running in the cloud or a solution running locally. And once you connect to your content management system, you can then see a list of all of the different mobile apps that you've got under development. Bear in mind here, this doesn't have to be done via an app store. So anyone in your organization can grab the latest version of the app listed in the catalog and open it and find that they're running a version of the application on their device. And this makes it super easy for non-technical people to manage their content and look after their mobile applications. And this is all enabled by the fact that we're using hybrid technologies, we're using web technologies to deliver our mobile apps. And I think we'll see increasingly over the next year or so that this is going to dramatically change the way that enterprises think about building and developing and managing their applications. So I have a few resources for you, various links that you can follow to read up a little bit more on some of the things that I've talked about here. I'd like to highlight the last one. Unfortunately, the PhoneGap Developer Day has just gone by in San Francisco, but there'll be a European version of that event taking place early next year, and the US version of that event will be taking place towards the end of next year as well. And it's a great place to go along to and to speak to the PhoneGap developers and learn even more about the platform. And I think that's probably a good place for me to stop and to hand over to Terry for some questions and hopefully some answers.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This has been really enlightening. One of the questions that came up is, are there any well-known apps from Adobe or others built with PhoneGap Cordova that you could mention?
So there's quite a number of companies, including Adobe, who are using PhoneGap in a range of different ways. And probably my favourite application, simply because it's a subject that's dear to my heart, is the Untapped social beer drinking application. And that's just a great example of a really usable application that meets a need in terms of functionality and is just fun to use. At Adobe, we use PhoneGap for a lot of our event applications, and that's where the ability to do over-the-air updates of your content is really useful. So if your event schedule changes, you can just push out a change to the content over the air, and the apps, all of the customers' apps automatically update. And there's lots of other customers using these technologies as well.
Oh, thanks. So here was another one, an organizational question. I have a large native development team. Should I use PhoneGap?
So that's a good question, and probably the answer to that is no. So if you've got a native team who are perfectly happy with the way that they're developing applications at the moment and not feeling any of the pain points around managing multiple different platforms, then really there's no benefit to you to switching to PhoneGap. Where PhoneGap really helps to solve problems is where you're dealing with issues with complex code bases across multiple different platforms and teams with perhaps limited experience of some of the more esoteric platforms that you're targeting, or where you want to enable developers to focus on building the unique experiences while you get marketing teams, for example, to manage the content of the application.
I see. A similar question. Can my web developers now jump in and build mobile apps?
Yes, with a caveat. So whilst hybrid applications are built with web technologies that are very, very well known, there are some unique characteristics to mobile apps that you need to be aware of to make sure that they perform well. So architecting your application as a single page application, for example, is critical to make sure that it feels responsive. And just as with any technology and any platform, it's possible to build bad apps with PhoneGap. So it's important to make sure that your developers are aware of the constraints of PhoneGap as a platform and aware of the best practices for developing PhoneGap apps in just the same way as they would need to be aware of best practices for iOS or Android.
And could you please talk about the security concerns with PhoneGap relating to protection of JavaScript source code and web technologies and heavy dependency on third parties?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So just as with any technology, you have to be aware of the security implications of what you're doing and how you're developing it, how you're developing your application. One of the interesting developments that's happening in the Apache Cordova and the PhoneGap world at the moment is there are a number of vendors who are starting to do audits of the various plugins that are available, and they're starting to create lists of validated plugins that they believe are safe and suitable to use on their platform. And two examples of companies doing that at the moment are Telerik and Microsoft. And I think this goes a long way to easing some of the concerns that people might have around security. But obviously, just as with native or with cross-platform, with any technology, you have to make sure that what you do follows security best practices.
Okay. There's a similar question with regard to performance of a PhoneGap app. How does it compare with a native app? How would you leverage caching as a means to improve performance, or any other means to improve performance, like touch delay?
Yeah, so that's something that's changed quite dramatically over the last few years. So if you rewind sort of 4 or 5 years, there were a lot of initiatives around building web runtimes and encouraging people to build web applications and widgets that would run on mobile devices. But at that point, they never really took off. And one of the reasons that was cited was performance. Since then, a couple of key things have really changed. Firstly, the JavaScript runtimes have become significantly better and can execute JavaScript code much faster than they used to, in many cases as good as native or very near to. The other thing is that mobile devices have significantly increased in capability. So today's feature phones are basically yesterday's smartphones. So we've seen a huge leap in performance of these devices. That, coupled with much better web runtimes, which allow you to get access to, for example, 3D rendering is significantly improved, means that really there are a huge number of use cases that hybrid can now solve without having to go for native code. And I mentioned briefly the importance of architecting your application properly. Things like developing your app as a single page application. So basically all of your screens are cached and just displayed rather than having to be loaded will make a big difference to the perceived performance of your application.
There was a question about what is the life of a developer like a given day when they're working on debugging across platforms?
That's a fantastic question. Honestly, I think it's just as painful to debug an application whether you're using native or hybrid. There are many challenges to making sure that your application works well. Probably one of the most important things to do is to make sure that you've got as many target devices as possible on your desk so that you can try your apps out and see how they respond, and also make sure that you keep a few different generations of devices on hand as well. So don't just test your device on an iPhone 6, dig that iPhone 4 out of the drawer and make sure that the app is at least as responsive on that device or at least works well. So the life of a mobile app developer is a tale of a million USB cables and multiple different phones all over a desk.
Is it possible to integrate PhoneGap developed features into a native app?
Yes, it is. So you can have a web runtime view within your native app, and you can use that to access your native capabilities from within effectively a mini PhoneGap view. There's lots of different ways you can blend the two technologies together.
How do new paradigms like Angular JavaScript fit into the PhoneGap web app model? Do they scale to provide a native-like experience, or is it too much for JavaScript for a weak processor, like a mobile processor?
So we found Angular works very well, and we've used it in a number of our applications. And in actual fact, the PhoneGap Enterprise application authoring environment within AEM typically uses Angular components, and we found that there are no worse performance issues doing that than for example, building mobile websites. It works perfectly well.
Going back to basics, what is the difference between Cordova and PhoneGap?
So Cordova is the open source project, and that's hosted at the Apache Software Foundation. And I'd strongly encourage anyone that's interested in this technology to go along and get involved in the community there, and to be active to help push this technology forward. PhoneGap is the Adobe commercial implementation of Cordova, although it's free to download. Once you start doing things like using PhoneGap Build a lot, then there are various charging options there. So PhoneGap is just the Adobe commercial packaging of Apache Cordova.
Well, is it really worth targeting the second-tier platforms, or shouldn't a person just stick with iOS and Android? What do you think?
So I think that the best way to answer that question is to ensure that you have analytics in your application. You need to make sure that you're, I think you should at least once try building your application for multiple platforms. Get analytics in there and get a breakdown of who your audience is, find out what platforms they're using, what versions of device they're using, and so on. And that will really help inform that the answer to that question. I think depending on the type of app, there are significant benefits to targeting the second-tier platforms. So one of the stats I hear is that some of the second-tier platforms deliver much more financial results than iOS and Android for the majority of users, simply because the iOS and Android stores are so huge that discoverability is a huge problem for people.
And kind of carrying that same idea, maybe this is our last question, where do you see the future of apps going on mobile devices?
So ideally, that in the very far future, I'd like to see app stores go away and mobile web become the platform of choice. There are a number of things that need to happen that need to take place in order for that to happen. For example, the mobile web runtimes need to become good enough that Apache Cordova is no longer needed, and in fact the Cordova communities have their stated aim to cease to exist, and they only really exist at the moment to fill a gap where the mobile web runtimes aren't delivering the capabilities. The other thing that probably needs to happen is better ways to monetize mobile web applications, and once you have that, then the App Store is no longer needed.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time today. I really appreciate this informative presentation and your insightful answers to these questions. A special thanks to everyone who's attending for taking the time to participate. You'll note that there is another webinar coming up next month, and be sure to be here. This webinar was recorded and will be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org/webinar. You can find announcements on upcoming webinars and other ACM activities also at learning.acm.org and acm.org. Please do go ahead and fill out our quick survey where you can suggest future topics or speakers which you should see on your screen. So this is Terry Linkletter, your moderator, saying goodbye for now. Take care. Thanks for joining us.